How's everyone doing?
We just got power back after an hour and a half.
Your power went out?
Yes. I'm right
Where are
near
you
Bay
at?
in Liverpool near Bayberry.
How bad was it over there?
Not nearly as bad as they said it was going to be. It was like a couple rolls of thunder, a little bit of wind, and some rain. That was it.
Sorry, guys.
Is anyone
Um,
going to be working on the New York Times project this weekend by any chance?
I am gonna get all of my HTML done because I was procrastinating.
I haven't done that either. So I plan
Because
on
that's due what, Monday?
Yeah, they both are.
Well, that's
Mm-hmm.
great.
Mm-hmm.
What do we need to do for the New York Times project?
Oh, there's a whole description of what he wants. Because I thought we were going to be doing some of it in class, but we're not. So,
Last year they did it in class. I think the timing was weird this year.
so we're on our own, I guess.
Um, well, if that's the case, looks like I'm gonna be doing another all-nighter or something.
Well,
What
if
were
anyone go to
the
common
directions for it?
space, it's too long to read, like to read out loud, but it's all in there if you go to the assignments.
Let's see here.
It's a lot.
Let's New York Times API. Oh, we gotta do JS for this too. Oh boy.
Yeah, that's why I'm like, I need some help with that.
Well, we got a couple things going for us. We can use cohort fives, YouTube videos. It was cohort five that did it in class, right?
Uh,
Somebody mentioned that.
I
Mm-hmm.
guess
So
we were
we can
supposed to
just
do this over summer break, which I didn't know.
That. Now I need to share my screen. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about JSON. Some of you may have encountered JSON already in your coding careers, but we're going to sort of do a little bit of an exercise to explain why it's a useful tool and how it's going to fit into sort of our broader discussion of API and networking. Okay, so the way we're going to start off here is we've got a problem. And this is a problem we're going to be coming back to a few times over the course of the class today. So let's say we need to make a network request to some API service, some server running on the internet. We need to make a request to that server, and in response, we want the server to give us back some data. In particular, we're going to make a request to this imaginary endpoint get/users. And in response, we want to get a list of all the users the system has. So somehow the server has to take this list of users and send it back to us in the API response, in the response body part of that API response. So kind of the question I'm going to pose initially is, how should we do this? Every user has some different types of metadata associated with it. So you have think of like a big table of users where you have like a row per user, And then you have maybe like a name column, a type column. So a type is either like a student or a teacher, an address, a city, and a state. So if anyone has any thoughts on how they might go about doing this, feel free to speak up. If not, I'll propose an idea, but I want to see if how anybody would think to do this. Nobody has any ideas, that's fine too, but I just wanted to see. So the way
Maybe
that
some sort of script.
can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Um, like I don't know, maybe some sort of shell script that can retrieve all this information from somewhere.
The note on the script is actually kind of you're maybe about like halfway there with probably where we're going to end up at the end of the class. An important thing, though, that you're noting is the data that gets sent back has to be in a format that the client can sort of like parse and understand. So what you couldn't do here is just do like a plain text list of just like arbitrary text of users.
I threw in the chat. I mean, after you get the results back and it gets converted from JSON, you can throw it all in an object.
Well, yeah, that's where we're going, but that's not where we're going to start. But you have the right long-term idea. Yeah. Um, okay. Let's what we really need to do here, kind of what both of you have pointed to, is we need some sort of protocol. So going way back to what we talked about almost 3 weeks, actually, I guess, yeah, like 3 weeks ago now. Wow, that was a while ago. A protocol is a way of sort of defining an interface, a format that is common that two or many parties can use to sort of commonly understand what a message means. And we need that here. We need some sort of way that we can take this data coming from the server and transmit it in a way where the client can like decode it and understand it. So kind of just like we started with the whole netcat thing, I'm going to make up a little protocol here, just like a way we could potentially represent our data coming back from the server. So maybe something we could do is we could take all of our bits of data and put dashes in between them. And then take every user and then like semicolon separate them. So what that might look like is something like this. So let's see, these are our two users. This might be what might get sent back from the server. So importantly, like name, type, you can see how they kind of correlate. And this here is the first user, and this here is the second user. So reading this kind of thing would not be that hard. So imagine you have this in like a string you get back from the server. You could sort of split it on a semicolon, loop through, split it on the dash, and get all the different parts. So I'm just going to put this in a new tab here, show you how this resolves. So you get something like this. So you sort of get all the parts pulled out as you'd expect. So this definitely meets the requirements of what I laid out. Like it's a way we can transmit this data in some sort of like common protocol that both the server and the client understand. So this works fine, but however, let's add some extra complexity. So this approach that I'm outlining here, this sort of like build your own protocol approach, is what a lot of folks do when they first get into software. They do a lot of this kind of thing when they need to send data back and forth from two different people or two different parties. And there's nothing explicitly wrong with it other than it doesn't scale that well. So let's go through a couple like examples of where this kind of thing falls down. So let's say we need to add a field. We want to add like a zip code to every user. So if we want to add a zip code, we can just add an extra field at the end, stick our zip code at the end. I would imagine relatively straightforward. In order to process this, though, we've got to update our unpacking code. So we have to add a little thing to the end here that looks at the last part in the list or in the array so we can pull out that extra zip. So take this, I'll bring this over here, run that. Now we've got our zips, which is good. So, okay, everything's good so far. Let's say that we want to remove a field. We want to get rid of our type field. So in this case, like we get rid of type, and then what will end up happening is sort of this type down here will go away. Okay, still relatively straightforward, I'd imagine. So we got to get rid of this bit in our parsing code, update all our indexes. Okay. Cool. No longer have that type in there. So you're probably thinking, okay, I'm going through this. Everything's working here. Where's the catch? Well, here's the catch. We've made some changes to our data format, and we've assumed that both the client and the server always change in lockstep. So the server sends data in the format, and the client, like if the server's format changes, the client that parses that format changes the exact same time. So they always are synced. In practice, that's very rare. In practice, you'll probably make changes to one end independent of the other end. So think like you're working with someone else's server and you have a client that you control and they control the server code. Because there's two different people that control the two different code bases, they can't change in sync, in lockstep. So a pretty common thing is you might do something like make some changes of the fields that get returned and not have the ability to update the client or vice versa. So in this case, here's our new format. So notice no type, but we've got a zip code. So it's sort of like the furthest iteration of our format. And then this unpacking code here, this is the original unpacking code way back at the beginning. So notice there's type, there's no zip. I mean, you can probably think through what's going to happen here, but if I take this and I paste this in and I run it, you're going to see things are going to start to look a little weird. So type is like, it starts an address, like things are kind of like offset wrong. And that's not so good. So here's another problem with this approach. What happens if we want to put a name like Jean-Luc Picard as our name? So if you think through it, like we're dash separating all of our bits. So if I take this, again, copy this over here and run it, you'll see that, oops, you'll see that our name is now split between these two fields, which makes sense. There's a dash in there. So it's doing the right thing, but it's just like that was kind of an oversight in our protocol. We didn't realize, oh, wait a second. It's possible for there to be like characters in the protocol that like are important in the text too. So in other words, this protocol cannot handle any of the fields containing a dash or a semicolon. It just like it'll just parse incorrectly. In some cases, depending on what kinds of data you're working with, that could be fine. But in this case, that's not so good. So that's also not very good. So how do we solve these problems? Because obviously these are not great and would like there'd be a real hurdle to dealing with this stuff in a production environment in real sort of servers and clients deployed in the real world. Okay, so this is where we get to JSON. JSON is a protocol that is meant for encoding JavaScript data of primitives, arrays, and objects. And it allows us to serve this purpose of having a shared protocol that can be used to send data from a server to a client or vice versa. So JSON is kind of like one of many different protocols, one of many different tools you could use to solve this sort of problem of how do you have a shared language, a shared protocol that the client and the server can understand. These days, I would say it's probably one of the more popular. And well, I was going to say something. I'll wait to say that until later. It's one of the more popular ones these days. So what is like JSON, like mechanically, how does it work? How do you write it? Well, here's an example of some JSON. JSON is a stripped down version of JavaScript. So what do I mean by stripped down? Well, there are three different types of data you can have in JSON. Just like JavaScript, JSON has like a syntax to it. It looks very JavaScript-like. But there's only these three different types of things. So the first one is what's called a JSON object. So a JSON object is an unordered set of name-value pairs. It's just like a regular JavaScript object. It works in the same idea. So you have a mapping of key to value. The only thing that I want to call out here that's different than something like JavaScript, JSON objects, the keys must always be quoted with double quotes. So this is not okay in JSON. You have to do this. There's a whole kind of history as to why that is, but it's just kind of the rules, just kind of got to follow that. Other than that, though, it's an object. You can do the same thing you could do in JavaScript. So you could have multiple keys and values. That kind of thing works, for example. Okay. The second type of data we have in JSON are JSON arrays. So an array is just like in JavaScript, an ordered collection of values. So in an object, you sort of have like a key mapping to a value. In order to get an access to that value, you sort of access it by key. With an array, just like in JavaScript, things are indexed by a number. So the first item is 0, the second item is 1, 2, 3, and on and on and on. It looks just like in JavaScript. There's really no gotchas here. It works exactly the same as you would expect. Okay. And the last type of data you have in JSON are what are called primitives. So unlike in JavaScript, primitives in JSON are a bit more limited. You have a couple different options. A string in double quotes, a number, true or false, or null. Those are your only options. So what this means is like, here's some example values. String in double quotes here, number, null. Some examples of things you can't do in JSON. You can't use like arithmetic or like string concatenation or anything operators. In JSON, no other extra stuff. Why is that? Well, JSON is a data format built for communicating data. It's not meant for performing programs or anything like that. What you're doing is you're taking your data and you're sending it from one place to another place. So because of that, any computations you do that before your data gets packaged to JSON and sent over the wire. More complicated stuff like regular expressions, those aren't allowed, or extra things like that. Strings in single quotes, not allowed. All strings have to be in double quotes in JSON. Okay. So here's a quick little example of what some JSON might look like. While I have this up on the screen, I'm going to keep going deeper into this. I just want to open it up for any questions folks might have. Any questions you have so far when I've talked about with JSON?
Yeah, I don't know if I missed it, but you said that the JSON is used for like translating JavaScript in a way something else can understand it.
Yeah, so imagine you have data. So not JavaScript, but like data. Like the list of users that I mentioned at the beginning is kind of like a good example here. So you're not taking JavaScript and literally sending like literal JavaScript text code. What you're doing is you're sending information packaged up in a way where the server knows how to package it up and the client knows how to unpackage it and read it.
Okay, and JSON is the means of doing that.
Exactly. It's one of many, but it's the one we're going to talk about in this class.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Anyone else have any questions so far?
Yeah. I got a question. What would you mainly use JSON for as like real life
Yeah. So imagine, and we're gonna at the end of class, we're actually gonna kind of do this as an example. Um, Imagine you have a server that has an API endpoint, maybe something like a get to I don't know, like slash comments or something. Gives you back like a list of comments that someone left on something. Um, what JSON can be used for is taking that comment data and giving it back to you sort of from the client perspective. The server can send it back to the client in a format where you can unpack it and understand it. The problem with what we've done so far up until now is everything we've sent in response from an API endpoint has been in some flavor of plain text English. And that's fine, at least initially, sort of as like to build proof of concept things. But fundamentally, if you want to include information in a response or a request body that is more complicated that you can represent by like a few words or something like that, you have to find a way to like segment your body into pieces so you can stick all the different parts of the data that you care about in that body in a way that the server can do that and the client can sort of read that out again. Does that make sense? Cool. I'm seeing head shaking. Okay. If there's no other questions, I'm gonna keep cruising through it. I'm trying to make up a little bit for lost time here. Um, okay. So just like JavaScript data structures, you can nest JSON. So what does that mean? Well, we've got an example here. So at the root of this, we have a JSON object. So it's the green curly braces. We have the key here of hello that maps to the value world. World is a primitive. So this is sort of like a string, true, false, a number, or null. One of those. Foo here is another key. And the value that foo maps to is this array. And this array contains three numbers, three primitives. So the thing I want to point to here is really twofold. First of all, you can nest JSON arbitrarily deep. So if you have an object, any value of an object can be an object, an array, or a primitive. So this means you can sort of, through combinations of nesting arrays and objects, represent some things like some sort of like arbitrarily complex concepts and data types you might want to send from a server to a client. So in other words, JSON really scales. You can use it to send like just like a mapping of things. Just an object, that's it. An object where like the keys just map directly to primitives. Or you can use it, you can have JSON that's like 20 levels deep with like series of arrays and objects to represent something a lot more complicated. We're going to talk about in a second some common patterns you might use to sort of give you ideas of like how you might go about structuring your data. But just the fact they can do that already, it's like it's leagues and leaps and bounds, excuse me, leaps and bounds above like what are kind of the format that we just talked about at the beginning of class would let us do. Like that only supports like a list of just like arbitrary sort of like columns. The other thing I wanted to mention, um, these the values here in this object are heterogeneous. So notice the thing that hello maps to, world, is a primitive, it's a string. The thing foo maps to is an array. These are different types of data, and that's totally fine. There's no sort of limitation in JSON that you need to sort of like map key to value and have like the data types always line up. So in here, like there's nothing saying like I couldn't go like this. Or there's nothing saying I couldn't put an object in here. And going even further, there's nothing saying I couldn't put like something like that. So like you hopefully see what I mean, where like you can just keep nesting as far down as you want. Okay. So we are going to, at this point together, I'm going to kind of lead us through this. I'm going to get one of the VS Code share things going in a second. I'm going to lead you through taking that user's data we had initially and replicating it as JSON. So I'm going to start by here. Taking this, copy that. Okay, I think that live share session should work, and I'm gonna put it into Slack real quick too, just so we've got that. Oop, share. Okay. Excellent. Okay. I'm gonna go. Okay, wait, where is it? There it is. Okay. So to start with, we have here two users, a list of two users. So if you need to represent like a list of two things, what kind of like array object primitive, what kind of comes to mind? What would you use to represent like a list of two things?
Object. You're trying to store like the title and then the value of that thing, right?
So using an object definitely makes sense for like representing like a user itself. But if you have like an ordered sort of set of things,
Oh, I got you.
then
An
you
array then.
probably want to use an array, I would think. So I'm going to start here by, I'm going to just make an array. So square brackets like that. I'm going to hit enter. I also should mention that indentation doesn't matter in JSON, just like in JavaScript. So you can sort of indent it however you want, however it works best for your brain. I'm going to kind of indent it here, sort of similar to how you typically would see it done. But you can kind of do it however you want. So if I have an array with a bunch of sort of items in it, I have like the item, comma, an item, comma, item, comma, so on and so forth. So if I want to represent now information about a user, maybe in this case, just our first user. So I have a series of like fields, like names, that map to a series of values. So name maps to my name, type maps to teacher, address maps to one of an old place I used to live, I don't live anymore. So if you have this sort of like mapping idea, in that case, like something like an object probably makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to take this object here. I'm going to make an object. And then I'm going to just sort of define the fields. So here, name. So if I hop back over here. So put my name in quotes. So I'll go name. And I'll do my name. And I'll just keep on making these here. So type teacher. Address.
Ryan,
Mhm.
is this the file that you sharing right now? Because I don't see it on my live share.
Oh crap, I forgot to save it. That's the thing I gotta do. Thank you. Um, okay. Does that help? Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Um, okay. City, Syracuse, state, New York. I'm just gonna quickly indent this a bit better here. So instead of putting it all in one line, I'm just gonna put like one per line. So just this is just like same kind of idea with JavaScript. You can indent it kind of however you want. Okay, cool. So walking through this here, I've got an array around the outside, and my array contains one item. That one item is an object. The key, in this case, the first key in that object is name, mapping to my name, type, teacher, so on and so forth. So this is an object with an array with keys and values inside. But we have a list of 2 users. We need to add a second user to this list. So because we have that outer array, that's how we can potentially represent like a list of users. That sort of handles that like list part for us. So what I want to do is I'm going to take this, I'm going to just copy this below, and I'm going to transpose in the new details. I think it was, yeah. Still Syracuse, New York. Yeah. Okay, so what have I done here? Well, I took this, I copied it below, and I put in all the transposed in all the information. So this JSON here, this represents our original user data. We have an array on the outside with 2 objects on the inside, the first and the second one. Notice the objects have the same keys and values. So name, type, address, name, type, address. That's a pretty common pattern. So this is kind of one of the first common patterns we're going to talk about. There's this pattern of having like an array of objects is something you see a lot when you want to represent like tables of data or something equivalent to that. So what you end up doing is a lot of like having an array and then have an object where all the keys in the object map to the column names in your table. So what, and then because they all line up, it becomes sort of they all sort of like just correlate to those shared column names. So there's nothing in JSON specifically that's saying like these have to line up. It's just sort of being done by convention. Like we've just sort of said that all of our objects are going to have the same keys and key names. And a lot of how you do things in JSON kind of tends to do that, where you kind of go by convention. You do things in a predictable way like that. And if when you're parsing it on the other end, if you encounter something where you're not expecting it in that format, then if it's on the server, you can raise a 400. If it's on the client, you can sort of just like handle that error in the client somehow. Okay. Um, any questions on this data here? Okay. So this next thing we're going to do, I'm going to have you do on your own. So I'm assuming you're all in the live code share session. If you're not, let me know. But I'd like you to take this here and copy it and paste it into your own sort of editor you can play with, just so it's not in the same thing that everyone has access to. And I'm going to ask you to make a change to this. I want it sort of to give you let you try to make some modifications to JSON on your own to see how it goes. So make a copy of this. Oops. gonna do that. I'm gonna copy it. I'll make a new thing. I'm not gonna say this. I'm just going to be temporary. I'm not gonna actually do anything real in here. Um, and then what I'd like you to do in this copy is I would like you to add an age to each user. So think about how you might go about doing that, where you might put that age, how you might structure it. And I'm gonna give you a few minutes to give that a shot. Let me know how it goes. Okay, folks, how's it going? I saw a few thumbs up. I didn't seem to do that, but I appreciate the gesture. Um, any anybody have any questions? We're gonna go through it in a second here, but just want to give a space for that first.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. You want us to just add the age to the list? Well,
I
to the
want
object.
Well, so I guess what I'm saying is I want you to add an age to each user, and I think
Oh,
it's
okay.
the thought here is it's up to you to figure out how to make that happen.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mhm. I mean, I'm also really curious what you all put my age as, so that'll be a fun one. Okay, well, unless anybody else has any thoughts or wants me to hold a little longer, I think we'll go through it here. So if you want to add an age to each user, typically the way you'd go about doing that is by adding something to each object. So it would tend to look something like this: age, and then do and you do like age down here, and then something like, I don't know, like 30. Effectively, what you're doing here in that like table model is you're adding a column to the end that's like age, and you're populating it for those two different values in that there's two different rows in that table. I do want to point out that just like in JavaScript, the order of keys in an object or the order of key value pairs in an object doesn't matter. So if you stuck this up here or something, you could do that. Um, and the order doesn't have to technically matter in the objects either, although usually when you write JSON, you do it just because you don't want to make yourself insane. If you have to like search through these objects for like keys and they're not in the same order, it makes it a lot harder to mentally think through it. Um, okay. So anybody have any questions on that? Or okay. So the next thing I'd like you to do, sort of the next step on top of this, is I'd like you to add to each user a list of colors. They could be like the list of their favorite colors. You can give a user any number of favorite colors they'd like. But importantly, this isn't just one favorite color. It's a series of favorite colors. So maybe like black and yellow, and maybe the other one's like red and green or something. So give that a shot. Give you a few minutes. Okay, folks, any questions on that one? List of colors. Okay. So here's how I would probably go about doing that. There's a few ways you could do this, and I think part of you could see it as part of the challenge or part of the fun of this is that there's like there's no right or wrong answer. There are maybe better and worse answers, but like there's a couple different ways you could do it. Probably the way though that would be the most common way you'd see something like this done is something like this, adding another key to your object, like favorite colors, and then make the value something like an array that has a bunch of strings in it. So like red, yellow, and the same thing down here. Something like that. So a few things I want to call attention to here. This is sort of a case where we're now starting to nest our JSON more deeply. So we've got an array containing an object where one of the values of our object is another array. So you can maybe start to see here kind of the power of that nesting. The other thing I want to call out is the name of the key here. So I choose to call it favorite colors. Could maybe just call it colors or something. But importantly, because I called it favorite colors, I had to figure out a way to sort of like represent that in a programmer friendly way. I guess I could have done something like this. Like there's nothing saying you can't do that. But typically you wouldn't really see that done. You would typically like the keys of things in JSON tend to be like valid identifiers in programming languages. So in particular, in something like JavaScript, that's like A through Z, uppercase and lowercase, numbers and underscore usually. Maybe one more thing. I think just underscore. Um, you could also do like make it camel case or something that works too. Um, doesn't really matter. You'll see different APIs and different systems follow different conventions. And really what's important though is just that you're consistent. So if you did something here, like called it like their age or something like that's, I mean, could be okay. But what probably wouldn't be a good idea is if you did something like this. Like try to be consistent in your formatting of things like keys. Um, that being said, even though that's like not great, you still will see it. um, okay, cool. So here's sort of our example JSON data. It's in the slides. So if someone's watching this later and sort of wants to go through this exercise on their own, they can just copy it from this and use that if they'd like. So, okay. So we've done a bunch of exercises here now, like manually editing JSON, manually writing JSON. It's something that you'll probably end up doing a fair amount of, just because you're going to see it used and you're going to need to like look at this thing and be able to like parse your way through it in your head. But that's not the primary use case. It's kind of I had touched on before. Like the primary use case is being able to use JSON to like have machines communicate with machines back and forth. So I think it probably makes sense for us to take a bit of a break now, just so that I don't forget about that. And when we get back, we'll talk about parsing JSON in JavaScript. And I've got a bunch of exercises we can go through. I think that probably makes sense. So let's, I gotta come up with an attendance word. Crap. Colors. Colors is our word. Okay, so let's maybe get back at like 7:40. Yeah, 7:40. Um, and then at that point we'll sort of do the last bit of this. Luckily today is not a crazy day, like what we have to cover wise. So I think we should be good. But cool. Well, sorry again, folks, on me being a little late, but we'll be back at 7:40 and finish it up then. Okay. Sorry, I want to keep moving here just because of the late start. Okay, so processing JSON and JavaScript. Actually, wait, before we do this, one last thing I do want to say on what we were talking about before. So before we had started with our sort of user data, walked through kind of a protocol we could use to encode it in maybe a more of a naive way, poke some holes into why that protocol wouldn't work, and then talked about JSON as a potential solution to encoding our data, setting from client to server or vice versa. This data here, this user data we've been talking about, I'm going to go back over to it in VS Code. So note that the way this is right now, it's nicely indented. In practice, a lot of JSON you're going to get from a server or sent over the network is going to be what's called compressed. So if you think about like this whole bit here that I have selected, every one of these dots is a space. If you think about it from just like a number of characters perspective, every character is probably about a byte that's got to get sent over the wire from the server to the client or vice versa. So all those spaces are just sort of like wasted bytes. They don't do anything. They make it easy for a human to understand. But if it's a computer reading from a computer, then why do you need like, all the extra space? So in practice, what you'll see a lot of is a JSON looks kind of like this. Oops. Ah. So what I'm doing here is I'm just sort of like pulling out all the white space. I don't know if I'm going to do the second one. It's going to take me too long. But the important thing here is if you see something like this, one of these, this bit of compressed JSON, what you should do, the first thing that probably makes sense for you to do is to take this and indent it. So go through and every time you see like a square bracket or a curly brace, go over an indentation level. And then add in the spaces where you need and stuff like that. So it's not to say you have to do this. You can, especially with some simpler JSON, read it in that compressed format. That being said, though, I think especially where probably most of you are at, it being that compressed format is probably going to be just add an extra layer of confusion. So I would recommend put in the white space. It's going to make your life a lot easier for trying to understand it. Also worth mentioning, there are some some tools and like browser extensions and stuff like that, that if you view JSON and it's compressed, it'll automatically format it for you. I'll show you one of those in a second when we get a little bit further. But so I guess what I'm trying to say is like you looking at JSON in a non-compressed format is helpful, and you should know how to do it. Like it's not that hard, but also there are tools that do it for you. So it's good to know how to do it, but also like you can often rely on the tools and not have to worry about it. Okay. So back to what we're actually talking about here. Processing JSON and JavaScript. So if you remember, JSON is like its own protocol, its own sort of like way of transmitting data. So when you get data from like, let's say the response of an HTTP request, remember we have that like the thing that fetch returns that promise that often gets put into a variable called something like response. And then that response variable has something like a .text on it that'll give you the response body of that HTTP response. What that text method will give you back is a string. So what you'll find a lot is sort of where you start when you work with JSON is you have a text string that came back from some other system that you can think of as just like opaque JSON. It's just like a bunch of characters, usually in compressed format. And you need to take that, you need to somehow convert that into the actual like JavaScript representation of that JSON. So keep in mind, like, I guess I will take this here. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to make a new tab. So what I'm talking about here is you get something that back looks kind of like this. So you have like a string like this. And importantly, like if you just took this raw thing and you pasted it in here, you'd be able to poke your way through it because JSON is like a subset of JavaScript. Like all the sort of rules are the same thing as JavaScript. It just so happens that like JSON is valid JavaScript. So you could like paste it in here, but that's not how it's actually going to go. Like how it's actually going to go is you're going to get it in a string. So because you're going to get it in a string, like this is what you're actually going to get. So you need to somehow figure out a way to convert this into this. Because unless you do that, like this is great and all, but fundamentally, like there's nothing you can use to like poke at that and like get the data out of it so you can do something with that. It's just sort of like a string with characters in it. So what we need and what we're going to talk about here is a function that will take this and convert it into this. And that function is called JSON.parse. So just like a lot of other things we've talked about in JavaScript, like fetch, set timeout, promise, stuff like that, it's something that's built into the language. So in any JavaScript context, there is this global JSON object, and it has on it this method called parse. So let's try this example here and see how that goes. And I'll run it and we'll see what it does, and I'll talk you through what it's doing behind the scenes. Okay. I'm just going to hit enter to start with. Okay. So initially here, we have this variable being made called text. And in this variable, I'm storing a string. And that string within it contains the bytes that make up some JSON. So in particular, just sort of reading this JSON by eye, we've got this object here with this key of hello, with mapping the value of world, this key of foo, mapping the value of this array, which within that array, there's 3 elements, 1, 2, 3. Okay, pretty straightforward. And then what we can do is, because we've got this stored into a variable, we can take and we can call this JSON.parse function. And this JSON.parse function takes, well, it takes more than one parameter, but we're going to call it only with one parameter. It takes one parameter, has one required parameter, I guess maybe is the way to say it. And that required parameter is the raw text, a raw string containing that JSON you want it to code. So this JSON.parse function gets called. It's synchronous, so it gives you back the parse data right away. And if I log out data here, you'll see this here is actually the like real parsed version of it. So to make this even more explicit, if I go like json.parse like this, I get this. So json.parse is that function that'll take the string version of JSON, convert it into the JavaScript representation of that JSON. So what json.parse returns in this case is a JavaScript object with a key of hello mapping to a value of world, and then and within that object, the key of foo mapping to a JavaScript array of containing 1, 2, and 3. So json.parse, any quick questions on that? Okay. Now, this sort of like is how you take the string and you convert it to the JavaScript version. But also, you sometimes might want to do the opposite. So imagine you need to send data from the client to the server. So you need to send the server some JSON. What you might do is you might take that, make a JavaScript object or make some sort of JavaScript data structure in the shape of what JSON you want to send, and then encode it as JSON, get those raw bytes, and then send those in the request. So there's sort of a use case of going both ways. And to go the other way, to take a JavaScript object or JavaScript data structure and convert it into JSON, we have this thing called json.stringify. So json.parse and json.stringify are opposites. So I'm going to run this. So in this case, we have that same data structure we had before, only this time it's the JavaScript version of it. Importantly, there's no quotes around it. And you also see here the syntax highlighting is correct. So if this was in quotes, syntax highlighting wouldn't be correct. And that's kind of one little trick you can use to know, oh, that's JSON. So I take this JavaScript object, I pass this to json.stringify, and then I get out this text string. You'll see here, my text string is what I'm logging out. And this here it's not expandable. It's not editable. It's like a string, like a literal text string. And just to prove it to you here, I'm also logging out like the type of this variable is a string. So like this is like a literal text string. Something that I also want to do just to prove it to you all is if I take this, so that the string version of my JSON, and I put that into json.parse, get that. And then if I put that into JSON, the result of json.parse into json.stringify, I get this again. So you see how it did sort of it back and forth. Importantly, json.stringify, it's going to give you compressed JSON by default. So notice here, like in my input JSON, I have some spaces, some white space and stuff like that. In the stringified one, it's not going to give you that. The reason why that is by default, you're usually sending JSON over the network, so you don't need those extra bytes. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so at this point, in the typical sort of workflow, you've made your request to a server, you've gotten back the response, you've checked whatever you want in the response to make sure it's like it came back okay, maybe the status code, you want to make sure that's good, maybe checking some headers, assuming everything looks good, you take that response, you call the text method on it, and you get the text content of the response. Once you've done that, you take that text content, you put it in json.parse. So there's a series of steps here that you're going to sort of end up doing over and over. We're going to get very repetitive here around how you tend to handle dealing with responses that come back from a server. Once you've gone through all that, though, and you have your response data as an object you can play around with, it's just a JavaScript data structure. So you can traverse it as you would any other data structure. So maybe like I want to get access to hello. I can do that. Or maybe you want to get access to the first item in foo. You can do that. So this is where like a lot of this is just having the JavaScript knowledge of how you might go about interrogating that data structure and accessing it. I will say if you don't have those skills quite as much yet as you'd really like to get to, one shortcut, one sort of like a cheat you can often take. Sometimes writing out these like series of traversals like this can be a little bit involved, especially if it's like stuff like this. Like it can sometimes be a little hard for folks to understand what this is doing, at least initially. So if that's hard for you, something you can consider is doing every step individually. So what that might look like is let first is equal to data.foo. And then let second is equal to first 0. And by doing it step by step, you sort of break it up. You sort of make it a little bit easier to sort of like follow and like do the one step per line in your mind. So might be something to consider. If you think you're beyond that though, like I definitely encourage you to sort of go through the like this sort of how you'd actually like lay it out on one line, because that's how people actually tend to do it. So as an example here, like with our user's data structure, let's say I want to get the first user's name. That might be how I go about doing it. So I take my data structure, I pass it into json.parse, I get the data, and then data 0. So getting the first item in the array, dot name, getting the value of the name key. Okay. Any questions on any of this? Json.parse, json.stringify. We're gonna I have like 2 or 3 more slides, and then we're gonna do a bunch of exercises. Yeah,
Can
go
you
for
go
it.
back to that example code you had? Not on the that your console. So I forgot my question. Oh yeah, you see at the bottom it says console.log.data 0.name.
Mhm.
Um, do you have to use data.0 if you're already using name?
So how I guess can you explain how like you would modify this to kind of doing what you're imagining?
So does name represent the value of name of
Yes.
the key
Um
value? Okay. So
what
like if oh sorry, for Ryan Gus, like instead of name, you wrote person in the array of the data. So at the bottom, would you do data 0 and then dot person, or would you do dot name?
Yeah, good question. So let me I think what might be helpful is if I get rid of the dot name for a second. So if I do this, I'm just getting the first item in that array. And you can see here that's an object with these keys and values. So
Mm-hmm.
I think probably seeing this, you could probably would guess and that here you need to do dot person to get access to this value, because that's what the
Okay.
key is.
I
Um,
wasn't sure if name was like a specific like syntax.
yeah, so that's just what I decided to call my key in this case. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, I would say though, importantly, like if my keys are heterogeneous like this, where like I have person here and name here, if I like did data 1, it is going to be a name because they don't line up. It's just sort of done by convention.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. So Joe asks, can you use reserved words as keys? In JSON, there aren't really reserved words. So yes, and especially because they're quoted. So just in JavaScript, if you wanted to use a reserved word as a key, you could quote it in an object too. Um, yeah, I think that answers your questions. All your question. Also, like you can, because it's in quotes, it can be anything. You can make a string. You can put like spaces in a key. You can like any character you put in a key. Let's say you wanted to put a quote in a key. You could do that by backslash escaping it, the same sort of way as you would in JavaScript. Um, so on that note, let's talk a little bit about what that initial example we had, that edge case around adding and removing fields, how that tends to get handled. So in this case here, thinking back way to the beginning of class, we had these these objects, or these sort of this like these 2 users where we added a zip and removed a type. And the problem was with when we were deserializing, things were getting shifted because the client and server disagreed on where the fields were and even how many fields there were. So with JSON, this kind of isn't a problem because if you structure your data properly, which is the important thing here, you structure like something like a row in like a table as an object, then if a column doesn't exist, then it's just like you're accessing a value on an object that doesn't exist or a key on an object doesn't exist, and that's undefined. So importantly here, it's still not going to work. Like it's not going to give you a value, but it's not going to fail in like a surprising way. It's not going to give you something that's wrong. It's going to give you nothing. And why that's better, I would contend, is nothing is something you can check for and you can have edge cases in your code to handle, where the value just being wrong, like the incorrect string, there's no real way to like validate or check that in your code. So at least here, you have the ability to like detect problems, where in the other example or initial example, you have no way to do that. And for the whole like Jean-Luc Picard thing, I kind of just covered that. But like in this case, the trick would be how do you include a quote in a value? And it works just like you would in JavaScript. So if you have like in JavaScript, if you want to put like a quote in here in like a string, you would backslash escape it. So put that backslash before. I'm guessing Max probably talked about that. So same sort of thing works in JSON. So just to prove it to you, if I do like json.parse and then do like something like this maybe. Well, let's see if I get that right. Oh yeah, I think I got to do that. There we go. Because I'm writing it in JavaScript, I got to double escape. So I've got to escape my escape so that in the string, I have a literal backslash and then a quote. So this literal, okay, and it's not even gonna, here, I'll do it this way. Yeah, there we go. So that's my string that then is getting json.parsed to give me this. Sorry, it's a little bit confusing, but hopefully you can see the mental leaps I'm taking there. Okay. Yeah, I kind of already talked about this. Okay, cool. So I think now we're gonna go to the exercises. So I have 5 different exercises. We're gonna see how many of them we're gonna get through based on time. So this first one is kind of similar to what we did originally. So I want you to take this string here. So I have this JavaScript here, this JSON, this JavaScript that defines a variable called JSON string equal to this long string that contains some compressed JSON in it. I'd like you to take this and then use the native JSON tools in the browser to convert this into a JavaScript object. I'd also say, don't worry about B yet. We're going to get to that in a second. Just give A a shot. So you're going to have to use one of those JSON functions we talked about. We'll give you a few minutes to do that. Oh, also worth saying, you can do this in like the developer tools, kind of like I have in just some random web page. Or if you're more comfortable with it, feel free to make yourself a little HTML file with a script tag in it. Doesn't matter where you run this. At least for these first few exercises, they're more just about like playing with JSON and less like the browser environment and stuff like that. So.
Would you be able to like highlight that and post it in chat?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, how's it looking? You want a few more minutes or
Few more minutes for me, please.
okay, yep, no problem. Okay, folks. I'm trying to be a little bit cognizant of time here, just because I want to get through at least a few of these. Um, so with this first one, the goal is to convert the string into a JavaScript object using the native JSON tools in the browser. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy this to my clipboard. I'm just going to do it over here in this developer tools thing console, just because it's going to be easy to play around. So I'm going to paste this here so we have this variable JSON string defined. Okay, that JSON string variable, it's a string, contains JSON. Guess it's like what the name says. um, we need a function that takes a string that contains JSON and converts it into a JavaScript data structure. So we talked about two of the browser JSON utilities, JSON.parse and JSON.stringify. Which one goes from string into JavaScript representation?
Is it the parse?
Parse, yeah. So I'm going to go JSON, or actually, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go data, let data equals JSON.parse JSON string. So I'm going to call the function JSON.parse, give it that JSON string variable, and then store the result into data. And if I take a look at data, we have this sort of data structure, which has some kind of more interesting nesting. So that's really all I was hoping you all would do for the first one, for the part A of the first one, rather. Any
Oh,
questions on that? Oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I didn't understand what we were doing. I thought maybe we needed to like parse and like get a specific key value.
Ah,
And I had a
yeah.
problem doing that.
Okay.
Like I did the
Um,
parse, but not the rest.
okay, cool. Um, I will say, like, that is something I think I've got a one in a few that does that. But cool. Glad to hear you got the main part of it figured out. Anybody else have any questions on this? Okay. So let's do number two here. So number two is going to involve you making a new defining JSON string again, but this time manually updating the JSON, manually changing the JSON in the string to add some new data into it. And after you've done that, to reconvert it again, go through what we just did for number or part A here and see if your new data is in there, see if it parsed successfully. So importantly, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be adding a new menu item. So in here, there's this menu. Actually, I'll go over here and do it. There's this menu pop-up thing, and there's a bunch of items in here. I want you to add a new item called save. So where the value is save, and the action is save doc. So you've got all these sort of value action objects here. I want you to add a new item into that array for save. And after you do that, reconvert it, make sure that your JavaScript object still parses. If you get an error when you call the parse function on those new changes you made, you probably have a small syntax error in your JSON. So this is where indenting it properly and going through can be really helpful to make sure you didn't miss a character somewhere. So give that a shot. I'll give you a few minutes. Let me know if you have any questions.
I do have a question. So I know you want us to add another key value to the string.
Mhm.
Should I do that while it's still an object? But I was thinking to stringify it. But is that something we do at the end?
So there's a couple ways you could go about doing this.
Oh,
So
okay.
one approach is you could take the string, you could parse it, you could make all the changes in JavaScript, like add or remove stuff to the data structure and then stringify it. You could do that. That's not what I'm asking you to do for this, although if you do it, I mean, and just looking at the result, I wouldn't really be able to tell. Um, I'm asking you, at least initially, just to make the hand edit this JSON. So take this, literally add the couple characters into this to introduce that new item, that new save item. Really, this is mostly just like I want to give you practice getting editing some JSON that looks a little bit more realistic, like you would actually get back from an API. Keep in
Okay.
mind it's compressed, so probably your first step as a hint is you should uncompress it so you can understand what the structure looks like.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, folks. Unless you want me to give you a few more minutes, I think we're probably going to go through this one. Okay, so I'm going to take this here. I'm actually going to opt to make a new tab in my code editor and paste this in here for now. Just so that we can have a little bit of an editing environment we can do some stuff in. So I hinted at this before, but my first step when given something like this, what I would recommend you to do would be to uncompress, add all the white space back into the JSON. So how you actually go about doing this is kind of okay. Why is the formatting thing on this weird? I'm going to do it in here. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So stuff like how many spaces you might use is kind of up to you. Usually JSON's 2 spaces, but it's a little bit more loose than other probably tools you might be exposed to. So really all I'm doing here is anytime I see a curly brace or a square bracket, I'm going over one. Every time I see, or I guess an open, I go over one. Every time I see a closed one, I'm going over the other way. And there's some where like I might choose to leave them all in one line just because they're small enough and I can read it, but I'm gonna, just for to be thorough, I'm gonna unpack all these. Okay, cool. So now that we've got this uncompressed, let's sort of explore this a little bit. So we've got this object at the root, this JSON object at the root. Within it, we have a single key called menu, and then a value within it that's an object. And the object has a bunch of key values that are just mappings from string to string, and then has this key within this object called popup, and the value there is an array. And this array contains a bunch of different items, a bunch of different like menu items. So you can probably look at this and pull a couple words from this, be like file, new, open, close. These kind of sound like the kind of things that might go in like a file menu in a computer for some application. I think that's what I actually stole this from. This is something that some JSON someone used to define the structure of like a menu system. So what I had asked is that you manually add a new entry into the popup array inside the JSON string, specifying a new menu item for save and with the action key save doc. So I didn't say where you have to put it. I said you have to put it inside of the popup array. I didn't say like at the beginning, at the end. I'm just going to put it at the end. Doesn't really matter in this case. So I'm going to put it at the end. I'm going to add my comma and I'm going to add an object. So I'm going to make this object just match all the other objects in the array. So it has a key of value and a value of save, and then a key of action and a value of save doc. Okay. So now that I've got this, I got a few different things I can do here to sort of bring this in and actually parse it. Probably what I'm going to opt to do is I'm going to take these single quotes around this. I'm going to replace them with backtick quotes just so that I can keep the multi-line string. But you could also just like recompress it if you want manually. So now that I've got this, I'm going to take that, reparse it. Oh, or sorry, get my updated string in there and then reparse it. So this should look very familiar from what we did with the first part. Now that I've parsed it, inside of here I have menu, popup, and notice now I've got 4 items in here. Instead of before, I just had the 3, new, open, and close. Close. There we go. So that's roughly what I was looking for you all to do, something kind of like that. So Joe said, "Oh, I did," and you sort of went about it a different kind of way. I think it was oh gosh, Deandra mentioned like we kind of talked about this at the start of this. Like this is another way you could go about doing it. So you could take your data, you could parse it, And then you could modify the parsed version and then restringify it. So what Joe did looks something kind of uh, like this. So parse it, and then go through and traverse through your data structure. So like menu dot pop up dot push. I'm just gonna copy Joe's code because I don't want to have to type all this. And then after you do this, like now pop-up is going to have 4 items in it, where before it only had 3. And now that you've updated it on the JavaScript end, you could then stringify it back out, convert it back into the string, and now the resulting string has them in there. This is like, you can do it this way. This wasn't what I was aiming for, but like it's a viable solution. I would say, even though you might have gone about doing it this way, I would encourage you to give it a try the way I sort of walked through it, mostly just because that skill of being able to like hand edit JSON, especially like compressed JSON, is going to come up, and it's something that you should have a little bit of practice with. But using the power tools is great, and I'm glad you picked up on that. Cool. Any questions on that? Okay. So I have exercise 2 and 3 here. These are both kind of similar to what we did here. So 2 is sort of 1A, but the other way. I think I'm gonna just, due to time, I'm gonna leave 2 and 3. If you want more practice, feel free to do them on your own. If you want to talk to me about them, I can maybe walk you through them and we can answer questions like a one-on-one, or if we do office hours this weekend or something. So I'm gonna leave them though for now, just because I want to get to the later exercises because those are a bit more interesting. Um, in particular, exercise 4. So this one, we're gonna need to pull open Postman. So for this exercise, we're now going to be making a request to our first API endpoint that returns JSON data. Just exciting. This is kind of a pretty important milestone. So what I would like you to do is, I'd like you to make a request to so on the careers encode.xyz server, I have a endpoint called /JSON. I'd like you to make a GET request to it. No body, no headers, just a GET to /JSON. And note down what you get back. Take a look at the response. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that.
Do you want us to note this down on like just for our own record, or put it in the chat?
Just I guess just do it to start with. Take a look at the response data you get back. We're gonna sort of do something to build on this in a second. I would hope at this point this is a relatively straightforward thing for you all to do. We've done a bunch of these sort of relatively straightforward requests with Postman. So I'm kind of just gonna ram through this here. Okay, so I'm gonna make a request to a get to queries encode that XYZ / JSON. What you get back should look something kind of like this. You get a status of 200. You get what looks to be this sort of data structure here. Now, a few things I want to point out. So is in the response, you'll see that our content type header here, which we talked about earlier in the week, is set to application /JSON. There's this semicolon char set thing afterwards. It's not that important. The important part here is application JSON. if this selected part wasn't here, it would still be like valid and still be okay. It's sort of like something that's being added on to be a bit pedantic on the server's end. So application/JSON is the MIME type for JSON. If you want to send or receive JSON from a server to a client or a client to a server, either way, you need to make your content type or accept header or whatever that needs to be in that case, application JSON. So that's the value you want to use for that MIME type. The other thing I want to point out is Postman automatically will pretty print your JSON for you. So uncompress it. If you go here and you select raw, you'll see it's all compressed. But if you go to pretty, it sort of indents it and syntax highlights it all for you and makes it nice and easy to look at. So this is one of those examples of the tools I said I'd mentioned where there are tools that will automatically format your JSON for you. And in many cases, they make it much easier to work with the data. Okay. So we're going to build on top of this. So we've made a request sort of an initial endpoint. We're now going to, I wanted to sort of do that to sort of give you an example of kind of how it typically tends to go. But we're going to sort of take it one more step here. I'm going to start here by helping you out with this one, just to sort of keep you going in a good direction. I just want to make sure that the important part of this you're all able to do. So I'm going to make a new tab or new file in the shared session that I'm going to start working in. And then once I'm done with it, I'll paste it in the chat so you can use it from there if you want or steal it from the session. Okay. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a small little HTML page that has an embedded JavaScript in it. And when this page loads, it's going to make a request to an endpoint on the server with fetch. And the data it gets back from the response is going to be JSON. So this is sort of like we're starting to get very dangerously close to the kind of stuff you do a lot as a web developer, and also pretty dangerously close to the kind of thing you're going to do with the New York Times assignment. Keep in mind, that hasn't gone away. That's going to come back in full force tomorrow. So I'm going to just start by laying out, well, if I can get the syntax highlighting thing to work right. Okay, cool. It is automatically HTML. That's great. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to call it number list. Yeah, okay. So this should hopefully all be very much a review to you all at this point. So okay. Cool. So we're going to start there. I'm going to click go live. Sweet. Got hello world. Hopefully that made sense to all of you. I'm not going to really spend any time on going into detail on what I just did there. So we need to make a request to an endpoint with fetch. So if you remember back to 2 weeks ago, how we went about doing that, there's this fetch function, the global fetch function. So this fetch function takes two parameters. The first parameter is a URL. The second parameter is some optional options. We need to make a GET request to careersencode.xyz/number list. So we got a few bits of metadata there. Method, that's GET. careersencode.xyz/number list. So we have our domain name. And we have our path. I'm going to take the result here. I'm going to put it into response. Okay. So if you remember, fetch returns a promise. So we get back that box that starts empty and eventually a value gets put into that empty box. So I'm going to go response promise dot then. Remember, then is the method that's on a promise that is given a callback that gets called once a value shows up in that box. So once that fetch request completes, the response comes back from the server. You'll get the response as a parameter to that function in the dot then. So this is mostly a review from the end of 2 weeks ago. It's coming back in full force now. So I'm going to save this. Come back over here. So if I reload it, we get logged out this response from the server. So importantly here, we're making the request successfully. We're getting the data back. And if we go over to the network panel and refresh, you can see we've got this number list request being made. Everything looks good. And also see a little preview of what the body looks like. So we've got a bunch of an array with a bunch of numbers in it in JSON. Okay. It's a list of numbers, number list. I guess that kind of makes sense. So we've got a response. Now we need to somehow take the data from a response, pull out that body data. So if you remember, there is a method on response called text. And if you call this, you get a promise. So remember, just like calling fetch, this returns a promise. So in order to use this, you've got to response body promise dot then, and then get the body. So just high level, what's going on here? Calling fetch, getting that response promise, setting up a callback to run once data shows up in that response promise. And then we're done with the script. We're waiting until data comes back into the promise. And then our callback function gets called with the data being passed into that callback function from the response from the server. So the thing that showed up in that box, the promise box, and we log that out. And we do the same kind of thing again right here. So we call this .text method on a response. That gets us the response body in a string text format. So that gives us back a promise, an empty box. We store that in a variable. We attach with .then a callback function that gets run once something shows up in that empty box. Once you get that text string in that empty box in the response body. And then the function completes and sort of you're just waiting in the background. And then once the value shows up in that box, once you get that string in there, then the .then function gets called, that callback gets called, and you have this body data. And there we go. And then you log it out. So if I save this, refresh, you'll see we have what looks to be a big JSON array being logged out. Okay. This is where I'm going to hand it all over back to you. So at this point, we have some JSON data coming from a server. We've kind of done 5A, I guess. Really, 5B is the part that is exciting. So I want you to, we're logging out this JSON data. I want you to do two things. First of all, parse it. So get the data, get it as an actual array that you can operate on. That should hopefully be relatively straightforward. Now, the second part is where this becomes a little more interesting. And I've written this out in sort of text here. So I want you to write a small little program that takes all the values in that array and adds them up, sums them, computes a total of all those values. There are a couple different ways you can go about doing this. We're going to go through a few of them, but I want you to give it a shot. If you're not successful, it's fine, but I want you to at least give it a shot. And your goal is after you've parsed the data and summed them all up, I want you to log out with console.log the total sum of all of the numbers in the array. So add them all up. And if you want, once you're done, add them all up manually with a calculator and check. But so give it a shot. Just to explain why this is important. We're getting dangerously close to sort of the whole path here. We're making a request to the server. We're getting back data. we're parsing it, and we're doing something with it. So now in our web page, we now have data that we're accessing that we didn't have when the page loaded. It's like new, it's from a server. And if you could if you think about it, once we have that thumb, we could take that and we could like put it on the page. We could like add it to the document. You talked with Max, I'd assume, about some of the ways you can modify HTML within JavaScript. We could pretty trivially just like add that sum into the page. And now, once you do that, you have all the tools you need to do something like the New York Times assignment. So you're getting data from a server, you're processing it in some way with some JavaScript, and then you're writing it to your HTML page to show it to the user. And now, all of a sudden, you've built an app that's showing data from a third-party API. Hopefully, that's pretty exciting to you all to think about. But that's kind of, by the end of tomorrow, that's where we're going to be. So anyway, I'll stop talking. I want to give you all a chance to give this a shot. I said I'd paste the code into the chat, so I will do that, just so you all have it. So either copy it from the session or from chat, whatever makes sense. Put that into a file on your end, kind of get the live share thing going. And then your goal is in here, write code to some numbers in JSON data. So give that a shot, and I'll give you probably like maybe 10 minutes or so. This is a bit more of a challenging one, so I want to give you the time. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, but good luck. Okay, everybody. I realize it's starting to get a little late here. I appreciate you all sticking around, everyone who has. How's everybody doing with this? Do you have any questions? Do you want me to go through it? What will be the most helpful?
I think going through it would be nice.
Cool. I am curious, just for my own understanding, how far did you all get? I imagine you probably all were able to parse it.
No, I don't know what's going on with mine. It says cannot get index.html.
Hmm. Make sure that when you start it, you do the live server thing in VS Code. So the little dead thing down in the corner, you don't just double click on the index.html or something like that. I'm gonna go through it. If you want to chat afterwards and see what's going on, though, like we can do that. Okay. So there's a few steps we need to do here. Step one, we need to parse the body into JavaScript array. Then we need to compute the sum and log it out. So this strategy here of kind of giving yourself a list is something I actually do a lot in real software engineering. Like I give myself a list of like a bunch of sort of sub pieces of a problem, and then I'll actually implement the code to do each sub piece underneath each item. So to start with, parse the body in a JavaScript array. Hopefully we've done this a few times now. This should make sense to folks. So something like array equals json.parse body. So body is that text string we get back in the response body. So array here is that value we get back from the parsed body. So I'm just going to log that out and make sure that worked. Cool. So we've got our parse data. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Computing the sum. So I said there were a few different ways you could go about doing this. Let's sort of think about it though. When you compute a sum, what are you doing? You're taking a bunch of values and you're adding them up. You have to perform an add operation for every item in your list. So fundamentally, you're doing an add operation for every item in the list. You're doing it for the first one, for the second one, for the third one. And you have some sort of value and you're like adding, you're like accumulating into that value. So I said some words there. We're doing it for every item in the array. So something like that, doing something for the same action for every item in an array. When I say that, I would hope that your mind immediately goes to, we need a loop. So we're doing something repetitively. So that's typically how you accomplish something like that in JavaScript. So what we need to do is we need to sort of like loop over all the items in our array. There's a few ways we can do that. Probably the easiest way is I'm assuming if I type this out and you folks haven't seen this syntax before, I'll switch it for a different approach. But something like const value of array, like this. So if I save that, you can see now we get a log for every item in the array. Just to make sure what I'm selecting here, this doesn't seem completely foreign to you, right? If it does, it's fine. Just let me know. I don't want to do something that's like really confusing to you all. Okay, I'm seeing subtle head shaking. Okay, cool. Sweet. Okay. So we're logging out. Yeah, Joe, you got the right idea. That's kind of what we're working towards. So we've got this value. We need to somehow take this value and do something with each of those items. We need to sort of combine them together in some way. The word I use, the fancy word you'll hear in sort of like data circles, is aggregate or aggregation. we're taking all of these and we're taking a number of different data points and we're combining them all together into one data point. So to aggregate something, we have to sort of like accumulate. We have to like combine all together into one value. So the easiest way to do that is make something like a variable. I'm just going to call it n. And I'm going to start by setting it equal to 0. And then every loop iteration, so in other words, for every item in the array, I'm going to add that item into n. So after every loop iteration, n is going to get bigger by the amount, the number in that array index. So Joe used plus equals for that. I'm going to do it the less complicated way, just to maybe make it a bit more easy to understand. What I'm doing here, it's equivalent to plus equals. So I'll do n equals n plus value. Actually, I'll keep the log. So what this is doing is every loop iteration, I'm taking my value and I'm taking n plus that value. So in other words, at least the first iteration to be 0 plus the value. And I'm taking the result of that, I'm storing that into n. So after the first loop iteration, n is going to be equal to 0 plus the first value. In other words, just the value. My second loop iteration, I'm going to take n plus the second value. So that's going to be, in other words, the n at this point is the first value. So it's going to be the first value plus the second value. And I'm going to take that, store that into n. I'm going to loop around again. The third iteration. Now, n is going to be the first value and second value, what we had before. I'm going to add the third value, and on and on and on. So what you're going to end up with at the end, after your whole loop iteration, n is going to be equivalent to all your values added except for the last one. And then you're going to be at the last one, and you're going to take all your values, put the last one, plus the last one, and you're going to get all your values all added up. So at the very end, I'm going to log out n. I'm also going to get rid of this log at this point just because I want to make it a little bit easier to understand. So this is the total I get of all those numbers. I'm just going to trust this is right because I'm pretty sure I know what I'm doing here. But if someone wants to go through and manually total all these numbers, I'm pretty confident this is going to equal. So like this plus this plus this plus this. So you can go through and do it if you want. But I'm confident that okay, you got the same thing. I'm going to call that good enough then. So sweet. So what we did here, this code example is probably about 85%, if not more than that, of what the New York Times thing is going to be. So I'm going to take this. I'm going to paste it into the chat. I gotta get rid of the comment in order to. I gotta cut it down by some characters in order to not hit the zoom limit. I got rid of the p tag in the body there, but I think that should still work fine for folks. Okay, yeah. So there's a full working example if you want to bring that over onto your own system and give it a shot. The one last thing I'm going to do, just to finish up class today, I realize we're going super long, but I appreciate you all sticking around for me here. So you've talked about with Max about how you can modify the DOM, how you can add, like change it with JavaScript. So the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a div with an ID of total. And I'm going to go down here and do something like document.get element by ID total dot inner HTML equals n. I'm assuming this does not look foreign to you. I'm pretty sure you've done this with Max, if not something pretty similar to that. So if I save this, you'll now see I've got my total on the page. So I'm going to close this for a second, just get the JavaScript console going here. Oh, wow, it's really dark in this room. My face is all lit up from the white. So like this here, like refreshing this, you see how like I refresh it, it takes a second for it to come in. It doesn't come in instantly. And that's because it's taking a second for the server to compute it for all the JavaScript to run. But fundamentally, what we're doing here, and this is like should be very exciting to you all, is we're getting data from a server and we're showing it to a user. And that's like a big portion of what being a web developer in practice ends up being. A lot of that kind of work. Cool. So I guess I'll stick this in the chat too, just so you all have that for reference. That's about it for today. I realize we've gone really long here. I appreciate you all sticking on. Anybody have any questions on any of that? Cool. Well, tomorrow we're going to talk about the last thing, which is more just like conventions about how APIs tend to be put together. And then after that, we're going to introduce the New York Times assignment and maybe give you all a chance to give it a shot a little bit, get started on it. So yeah, hopefully you all found that an interesting class, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Have a good evening. Bye, folks.
Have a nice night.